Okay. Testing, testing.
Testing.
You got the song. I love that about you.
So, I already told you the thing about speaking in the mic.
Yeah.
There you go.
I mean, it's a classic.
It is.
And we are coming up to that time of year once again.
Yes, and we are obviously sisters. So,
But then Rosemary Clooney and what's her name didn't
Oh,
look
yeah,
much like
that's true.
sisters either.
that's true.
So,
Yeah.
what's sad is that Rosemary Clooney actually looked heavy next to.
Well,
Oh my
she
God.
was so, it was
Yeah.
too.
It's messed up. We couldn't watch that movie. We were like, man, that's messed up.
There's a couple of scenes. Vera
Yeah, I can't, she always wore high neck things.
Yeah.
wore high neck things, but her legs, like she had. And there's a couple of scenes. One where she's doing like the tap dance, and she's in this itty bitty little skirt, and her legs are just so tiny.
I heard she had an eating
Yeah, I was gonna say she had to have had an eating disorder
disorder. That's hard.
at a time when who talked about eating disorders?
Well, and they had to do that for Hollywood. I mean, to.
Oh,
Well,
yeah.
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 Well, and I have my stories about Hollywood too, so.
Oh, yeah, me too.
But when I was in Annie, I had a friend that had an eating disorder. And, like, who knew? I had never heard of anorexia, bulimia. But here I was at 10 years old going, okay, well, I need to go to the library and find out what this is, because we didn't have computers.
Yeah.
And so I did. I went to the library to find out what it was and what it meant and what I could do to help.
Yeah. Oh, that's
Yeah.
Hollywood. Ooh.
Right?
Yeah, the pressures on women are already so much, but then you put that extra layer of Hollywood on things.
Yeah.
Okay, it is 7:30 right now. Should we officially start?
Okay. Did you want to start with some music that you were playing earlier for this? Or?
I don't know what have licensing rights to.
Oh, gotcha.
Gotcha.
Yes.
Well, then we'll just start. Hi, guys. I'm saying guys because there's literally only men here in the audience.
Yeah,
But
we
appreciate
apologize.
that.
Hey, we're thrilled. This is a treat for us, and we're
Right.
just thrilled that anybody's here. So thank you so much for coming.
Oh, look, there's one more! Hey! So, I am Patricia Pax, and I was the voice of Peppermint Patty.
And I am Carrie Schaefer, and I played Sally Brown twice in You're a Good Man, Charlie Brown. Not in the same echelon as she did, but I still like to say it. And together we do.
The Peanuts Gallery. It's a podcast that I came up with. Every time I would go to a Comic-Con, I would end up having a conversation with somebody where they would come up to me and go, I'm a Charlie Brown. I've always had depression. Or they'd say, I'm a lioness. I've got so many anxieties and so many insecurities. And like every show, I would end up having this conversation multiple times. And so at one point I was like, so to kind of back up, I grew up in LA and I started acting professionally at 6 years old. And when you're an actor in LA, you have control over nothing. I used to say my job is waiting. I wait for somebody to write a script. I wait for somebody to decide they're going to produce it. And then I wait for a casting director to send out a notice, and I wait for my agent to say, oh, Patricia would be good for that. And then the casting director has to approve it, and the director has to approve it, and the producer has to. Like, there's this whole line of people that have to go, yeah, she's the one we want. And even with doing the Comic-Cons, like, it's oddly competitive to getting to these shows. And, you know, are you a big enough star? Are you important enough for us to, you know, pay this money? Because it costs them money. They pay for airfare, they pay for, you know, a hotel room. A lot of times they'll take us out to dinner. So there are costs associated with that. And I understand that. But I'd gotten to this point where I was like, I want something that I have control over, that is something that I'm passionate about, that is fun to do. And so I started thinking about a podcast, and it just seemed like a natural fit to do a podcast on all of these characters that are so quirky, and yet you've worked with a Charlie Brown. You married a Lucy.
I'm so sorry.
That's straight up.
Right? And so I met with a bunch of women to have a co-host. You know, I wanted somebody that I felt would kind of be the yin to my yang. And Carrie already had a podcast that she was working on, and we just clicked. And there were other people that I felt would have done a great job, but there was an energy that she brought to this, and that I think she continues to bring to every show. I tell her all the time, I love the questions that she asks, because I have a tendency to like have everything planned, and I have all these questions that I can ask, and you know, and she just comes up with these things off the top of her head, and I'm like, that was such a great question.
Well, that's my husband. This was years ago. I mean, I was maybe 20, 22 or something. He said, what do you want to be? And I said, well, either a professional friend or a professional question asker. And so I am. I'm a life coach by day, professional friend, and then a podcast co-host, professional question asker. It's so fun because through the show we've gotten to meet so many amazing people who have been in the industry.
Yeah.
We've done so many cool things, and you just get to wait. I get to be on a show where I get to ask all these people whatever I want to ask them about what they do and what they love.
Yeah.
Brain explode.
So, and I have to say that most of the time on the show, I just spend laughing.
Yeah.
Which, you know, like to talk about narcissism and laugh about it, like you wouldn't think a subject like that would be funny, right? Because you've lived it and it wasn't funny. I'm sorry, I shouldn't be picking on you, but I mean, you know, you put yourself out there, so. But we had Allison Arngrim, who was Nellie Olson on Little House on the Prairie on the show, and we talked about the differences between Mrs. Olson, who was a narcissist, herself, who was just sort of trained and raised up to be this selfish, self-centered person, but she wasn't really. She just didn't know it until she met Percival. And then after she left the show, do you remember Nancy? So Mrs. Olson, after Nellie grows up, adopts a little girl named Nancy, and she turns her into the next Nellie. except that this little girl is a pathological narcissist. And the difference between a regular narcissist and a pathological narcissist is that a pathological narcissist will try to kill you with a smile on their face.
So yeah, we had a whole show, and the prompt was, who's the bigger narcissist? Nellie Olson, or Mrs. Olson, or Lucy Van Pelt?
Yeah.
I think, what did we come up with?
Well, we decided that Lucy was actually the biggest narcissist because she spent 50 years and never once let him kick the ball. Not once. And he was very specific about the fact, because everybody kept saying, well, it's the end of the thing, it's been 50 years, you know, you should let him kick the ball. And he was like, no, like he spent a lifetime never getting what he wanted, and yet he still always had the hope that he would. And hope is such an amazing, powerful thing to hold on to. And for this character to do it for 50 years and always think, this time, this is gonna be the time that she's gonna let me kick that ball. This is gonna be an amazing day. And then it wouldn't happen. And that happens to so much of us, where we think, this is the thing, this is the person, this is the job, this is the, right? And I think it can be really easy to get lost in that hopelessness that we all feel. Especially doing this show, I have come to believe depression is absolutely natural. You cannot get out of life without being depressed. Male, female, young, old, it doesn't matter. Stuff happens. You lose a job, you lose a relationship, you lose your parents. Like, you have to go through these things in life, and depression is just a natural aspect of it. And we've put so much shame onto those feelings. And we tell you, oh, you just need to go out and find somebody new. Oh, you just need to go out and get a new job. Oh, you just pull yourself up by your bootstraps, right? Because that's what we do. None of that helps, right? None of it is gonna make us feel better without having those moments of hope, without having those times where we go in ourselves. You can tell me all you want, but we have to feel it in ourselves. That moment, that little bit of hope that goes, okay, yesterday sucked, but you know what, tomorrow's gonna be better. And that's what the show is to me, is finding that bit of hope in a world that kind of seems hopeless sometimes, you know? I think it kind of doesn't matter which side of the thing that you're on from the other day. This has been a bad time in America, right? And we've all lost friends, or we've pushed people away. And what has come to me in the last few days is this sense of hope that it will be better. It can be better. We each have to reach out to one another and be a friend, be somebody to talk to, reach out to each other. If you all don't know each other, like, introduce yourselves to each other at the end of this, right? Because you all know you have something in common, you all like peanuts. And that's a starting point, right? Like, what else are friendships built on? If not something like a comic book, or a television show, or a job that you do. And I'm going to stop preaching and let Carrie say something.
I've always thought it's so interesting because these characters have endured for so long. I mean, one of our favorite movies is the new Peanuts movie that came out in 2014.
Yep.
My kids, I mean, this is a comic strip from, when it started in the 50s?
1950.
1950.
We're next year is the 75th year of Peanuts.
Yeah. I mean, that's a long time, yeah. It's endured for so long, and yet my kids and I can watch this movie that is new, and it still resonates today. And so I wonder, because back in the day, I remember when I was first cast in Your Good Man, Charlie Brown, and I was like, oh yeah, it's a kid's show, da, da, da. And then I kind of fell into the world that is Peanuts and Charles Schulz, and I said, whoa, something bigger is going on here. These characters resonate, and these characters endure. Why? Why are we still talking about this comic strip when so many comic strips have popped up and we don't really hear about them anymore? So what is it about this comic strip? And I kind of did a deep dive into, oh my gosh, like these characters are different pieces of our psyches. They're different parts. If anyone's ever heard of IFS, internal family systems, like parts work, these are probably maybe different parts of Charles Schulz, but we all have these different parts. We all have the part that's like, I'm a failure. Everything that I do, I can't do well. And we all have the part of us that's just kind of, our wildly fantastical part, which is, Snoopy and the Flying Ace and the Red Baron and all of that. And we all have, there's philosophical parts of us, the Linus parts that are kind of, well, actually, if you think about it like this, Charlie Brown, and then we all, and so I think that that's what makes this cartoon, this comic strip, so much more than just that, is he was actually kind of looking inside at his own self and pulling up these different parts of himself. And so that's what we think is so interesting, is on our show we'll talk about specific strips and how it relates to things that are happening today and what we can pull and glean from them today. We also talk a lot, we talk to people on the show that are also animators themselves. We also talk to people who knew Charles Schulz, other child actors that were voice talent, and a couple of animators that knew him. And I mean, we have one that is an expert on everything Peanuts, and it is so fun to get to be able to talk to these people about just this thing that we both love. So.
Yeah. If you don't know the artist Robert Pope, you should look him up. He draws for Peanuts. He also has done like Looney Tunes stuff. And,
Cartoon Network.
Yeah, he's done a ton of stuff, but he is a huge Peanuts fan, to the point that he can actually quote, I kiddingly call it chapter and verse, but he'll sit there on the show and be like, well, on October 16th in 1978, there was a strip that he did, and then he'll just just off of memory, read the entire strip off, and then Charlie Brown says this, and Linus says this, and then Lucy shows up in the last, and we're just like, what?
It's amazing. It's so fun talking to him.
Yeah.
We just recently did an episode about it's the Great Pumpkin, Charlie Brown, and we had him on and we talked because Halloween and Thanksgiving coming up and kind of all this pumpkin-y, cool holiday stuff. And he was so fun to have on there, just unpacking this classic episode. We've all seen it. It's the Great Pumpkin, Charlie Brown, and so that was really fun.
Yeah, and he brought up a lot of things about the animation and the colors that they used and how they transitioned from one to the other, that I went back and watched it after listening to his descriptions, and I was like, wow. Because it was little bits and pieces that I hadn't noticed, because I'm not an animator. You know, I can tell you about the acting because that'll stand out to me, but his description of the animation process, just every time he's on the show, I end up seeing things differently, which is, you know, it's part of the fun of doing something like this. It's part of the fun of coming to a show and listening to a panel, because you're gonna experience Peanuts in a different way in the future. You know, you maybe never thought about the fact that they had all these psychological issues before, but I guarantee you will now, right?
Do y'all have a specific Peanuts character that you relate to? That's the first question we ask people on our show. So right now, you're on our show. Congratulations. Who here relates to Charlie Brown? Who's like, yep, that's my character?
Nobody?
Wow.
I think it goes in.
Yeah,
I think
I did
over
for a
time.
long time
Yeah.
when I was working for us.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Over time, I feel like I've like weaved in and out of a couple of the characters.
Okay,
But for sure.
okay. What about
I
Linus?
mean,
Okay,
Yes.
okay.
Oh, we're in
Yeah.
such good company. Linus is such a great
Right?
character.
Right? It's funny because, yes, I was the voice of Peppermint Patty, but on so many levels, I am Peppermint Patty. I mean, aside from the fact that my name is Patricia, which is a weird
So
coincidence. So weird, right? But I look like her if she'd grown up and gotten a nose job. Because I don't have that nose. But like, I look like her, and obviously I sound like her. But also, there's all this stuff out there that she has ADHD. I have ADHD. She's dyslexic. I'm dyslexic. It depends on who you talk to. Some people will say that she's bossy. I prefer to use the word leadership. But, you know, she was always the coach, right? And she was always encouraging Charlie Brown, Chuck, and, you know, all these other characters to play better. And, you know, she taught swimming and baseball and football, and like she did all the stuff as from a leadership position. And I mean, I've been accused of that. I've also been accused of being bossy, but so it's kind of funny to have those moments where we connect with a comic strip. You know, like he's just a round-headed boy with a little squiggle on his head, and yet so many of us relate to these characters even after 75 years, you know?
I think we're 20 minutes in. Does anyone have any questions?
What about Schroeder?
Does anyone relate to the character of Schroeder? Oh, you were just asking.
I've always been fascinated with Schroeder. I mean,
So the idea behind
It's
Schroeder,
always very centrally,
Yes.
you know, central to the episode, but
yeah,
not a ton of dialogue.
not a ton of dialogue. So the general idea behind him is that he has Asperger's. And when you start looking at how he doesn't ever look at Lucy, he very rarely talks, he's so focused on his piano.
Special interest.
That's all very Asperger's. And in fact, Charles Schulz, apparently in his much later years, like in his 70th year, was diagnosed with Asperger's.
I mean, you'd have to be, right? He drew this thing for 50 years without getting bored.
Yeah.
I mean, that screams special interest. I'm married to somebody on the spectrum, and my son was just recently diagnosed as having ASD as well. And these are people, both my husband and my son, are absolutely brilliant and obsessed with the things that their special interest. So
Yeah.
absolutely, there's so much about Schroeder that I can see in both my husband and my son.
Yeah,
For sure.
yeah. And one of the aspects that I think is really interesting is that by putting it into a character like this, we can normalize things. We can normalize depression. We can normalize the behaviors that Schroeder had, right? Doesn't make him weird. It doesn't make him different. It just makes him Schroeder, right? And that's such an important thing for all of us to remember, because my dyslexia and my ADHD, I have struggled for years. I literally got my diagnosis about a month ago for ADHD. I am 57 years old, and I have spent my entire life saying, what's wrong with me? Why can't I be more focused? Why do I have doom piles in my house? Why can't I be, right? And finding that getting this diagnosis has been for me really life-changing, because it's not me. There's nothing wrong with me, right? I have this thing, and this thing has made it possible for me to come up with the idea for a podcast. It's made me be the actor that I am. It's made me the entrepreneur that I've always been. I've had 5 or 6 different businesses throughout my life. And when you start looking at what the advantages are to some of these things, the advantage of Asperger's is being able to focus and just really become this perfect example of whatever it is that you do. To be able to give that much focus and energy and love and attention to that one thing, that's a gift. And so when we meet new people that we might think they're a little different, if we can change that conversation to that difference makes them be that unique person, I think it just opens up all of us to be more caring and understanding people.
I think to your point too, where he's introducing these characters and they really are, it's giving people permission to really be themselves, even though they probably in the 50s we didn't see so much the representation of Asperger's or ADHD, Another thing that he did was bringing Franklin into the cast of characters. I mean, this was a person of color in a time where, there wasn't as much representation. Even Peppermint Patty, a girl that wore shorts and Birkenstocks and played football and was like bossing the dudes around, like he saw that wasn't being represented, and he wanted to carve out a space for that representation, which is huge. I mean, very, very pioneering for the time.
Absolutely. Do you guys have any questions that you'd like?
If I apply that same lens to a character like Pigpen, what do you think was the driver behind that character? What personality part do you think he represented and why was he depicted that way?
So I'm trying to remember. I want to say that it's OCD. obsessive compulsive disorder, which in some people puts them in that they're gonna clean everything, everything's gonna be perfect. But for other people, it puts them in this other realm of everything is dirty, everything is, now, there are some that say Pigpen came from a dysfunctional family, that he probably was living with hoarders, right? That he probably was not as wealthy as some of the other kids. So again, that sort of representation of not everybody's perfect, and it's okay. He can still be our friend.
He still gets to have a seat at the table, even
Yeah.
though he's, you know, the dusty, dirty kid. I mean, there is a place for everyone, and he's also really very confident about his dust. You know, like, and that's kind of cool too. You know, perhaps I remember there were kids in my class growing up that they didn't have access to things, and there was, I remember the smelly kid, and it's heartbreaking, and it wasn't their fault. There was some real neglect and lack at the house, and a lot of times those kids get ostracized. So the fact that he chose to, Pigpen is just another one of the kids. And yeah, they'll be like, oh, it's too much dust. And they'll be like, well, actually, here's how it could be kind of cool, blah, blah, blah. And like that, I think it just screams to us, like, everyone is welcome here. No one is left out, except maybe Charlie Brown, which is interesting because the whole thing is about, like, he is centered as the main character.
And he's always left out.
Yeah, and he's always, like, so, which I think is fascinating. And yet, he's also the hero of the whole thing. So he chooses to put him in this really interesting middle ground where you think, ugh, loser, bye, fringe, margin. And yet, no, he's right there, right in the center. And he's making a statement, I think. He's making a statement about people that are on the margins get pulled into the center. That is the space that Peanuts takes up. That space.
Yeah. They also lived in an incredibly mean town. Because when we were watching The Great Pumpkin, there were 3 houses in that town that specifically kept rocks for bad costumes. It wasn't specifically for Charlie Brown. They didn't know it was him, right? But they had rocks for bad costumes. That is a mean town to grow up in.
And is that the adults doing that? Like,
yeah.
My gosh.
All the kids were out getting candy.
I mean, that's savage right there. Any other questions?
I was gonna ask the same question about Marcy,
Marcy, yeah.
you know, Peppermint Patty's sidekick.
Yes. Oh, he doesn't want to say it out loud.
No,
Oh.
not that question.
I see what you knew, what question I was talking about.
I did. No, just, you know, the same question that Whitney, you know, asked about the other character, just sort of what personality traits that she represents.
Interesting, because there's like a yin yang situation.
Yeah. You know, I have to say, I haven't done my research on Marcy enough to be able to say, yes, this is what her issue is. I'm gonna have to do some digging now.
She always seemed to, at least to me, to be the straight man. I get it. I'm sorry, the straight person.
No, I know what you mean, in a joke setup,
Yeah.
where you have the funny person and then you have the straight person, and the
Yeah.
straight person is always setting the funny person up for the joke.
Exactly.
Is that what you're talking about?
Yes, and she was also a voice of reason.
Yes.
Yeah.
In every situation you saw her in, she would either talk Peppermint Patty down, or she would talk through a scenario and keep it human. In my mind, I always saw her as the compassionate person rather than the strong-headed person, and she actually took everybody else's feelings into consideration in most everything she did. So that,
Yeah.
I always saw her as very compassionate and very caring, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And quite possibly that's why I haven't run across that much information about her, because she really kind of was the normal
Yeah.
person
Yeah.
in all of this chaos and craziness.
True, very true, yeah.
You know?
But I also think I've always thought of Peppermint Patty and Marcy as like, I'm not saying a couple, although, cool.
They were almost like one person.
But yeah, they got
They were-
grouped
yeah.
together. It was like they were a duo,
Yeah.
Yeah.
you know? And so I feel like Peppermint Patty, there's a lot of like, she's not super self-aware a lot of times.
She is
She's like,
not.
stop coming on
But
to me,
Marcy-
Chuck, you
Marcy-
sly dog. Meanwhile, Charlie Brown is not hitting on her
Yeah.
whatsoever.
Yeah.
You know, and whereas Marcy seems very self-aware, logical, but yeah, empathetic enough where I feel like Peppermint Patty just kind of bulldozes people sometimes, not in the Lucy way.
Not in a
Not
loose
in a
way,
loosey way.
not in a mean way.
So-
She means well.
Right, she has good intentions, but I
Yeah.
feel like Marcy balances Peppermint Patty out and almost functions as her conscience almost. Well, if you think about it, sir, da 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 da.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
And Peppermint Patty's like, oh yeah, almost like I've never even considered that before. Like, oh okay. And now she doesn't always take her advice.
This is true. This is true.
How many times do we hear that thing that's like, maybe you should consider this, sir? And we're like, yeah, I'm gonna do it anyway. But that's interesting. I love that you asked that question about Marcy. I
Yeah.
think that's really cool. I love her as a character, and I wish we had more of her as a character.
Yeah.
Anyone else?
Anybody else?
You can also ask about other things too.
Yeah.
She has she's got a lot of cool things going on between being, a child star, and she's worked with Charles Schultz.
Yeah.
She knew him, in fact, out at the table. There's a cool picture of her when she's 10, and it's black and white picture, and there they are together.
Yeah.
So
Back in the day when they didn't have color photographs.
Yeah.
Actually, I'm kidding. They did.
So yeah, fire away, or we'll just
I got one. I don't know if you guys got the answers, but I've always been confused about the little red-haired girl and Peggy Sue. Is that the same person, or are those two different people? Peg Jean. Thank you.
Yeah. So they're different people. I actually read the Schultz biography. And it was really interesting because so many of the characters were actually people in his life. So there was a guy by the name of Charlie Brown, and they referred to him as good old Charlie Brown. And so when he got the opportunity to do this strip, he was like, hey, I hope it's okay. But I decided to use your name for this cartoon. And at first, he was like, oh yeah, that's great. Thank you so much. I'm so honored, And apparently years later, he was like, yeah, he's not the greatest character and he's not anything like me. And he was really off-put by this character. But over and over again, like Lucy was his wife. And so there are certain points in his life that if you were to look back and look at the timeline, you can see where things were not going well with Lucy. And he actually had an affair at one point with someone. And so some of the characters, the little redheaded girl, are his unrequited. Yeah. And so his Peppermint Patty actually came about because he had a conversation with his cousin one time, and she said, there's nobody like me in media. I wear shorts and I wear Birkenstocks and I play sports, and there's nobody in media that's like me. And he was like, well, there will be now. You know, this was 1966. And what a lot of people really aren't aware of, in 1966, a woman couldn't own her own home.
What?
A woman couldn't have a bank account without a husband or a father on the account. Like, so Peppermint Patty came out at a time, sort of the beginning of the women's lib, right? But her TV contemporaries were I Dream of Jeannie, Yes Master. So this character was so far out of bounds for what was considered normal at the time. And like she mentioned earlier with Franklin, like he was always pushing the boundaries, but he was pushing those boundaries because they were people that he knew, you know? So a lot of it, when he would talk about how each one of these characters had something of himself in it, and yet it's real when you look at who their friends were, who his family was, you know, over and over again, there would be similarities to a character that he introduced. So a lot of those smaller characters were just friends in his life, people in his life. Yeah.
Why do you think the teacher, I think is Miss Akmar, if I'm not mistaken, why do you think the teacher was represented the way that she was with her voice and how it was always masked and never intelligible? And the second part of that question is, why were there never any adults pictured or represented in the strips or in the specials or anything like that? What message do you think was being sent there in both of those scenarios?
Well, so we all called him Sparky. The first day that I met him, he said, all my friends call me Sparky. You're now my friend, so you call me Sparky.
Uh-huh.
So Sparky has said that boy, I just totally lost my train of thought.
It happens.
What was your question again?
About what do you think the teacher was
Oh, the teacher.
was
Right.
represented the way she was, and then adults were not pictured.
So what he said was that in order to show a teacher, you would have to show from a different angle,
Okay.
right? So you couldn't be this close and show a kid.
Okay.
You would have to go back here to show the adult. And he didn't ever want to have to take that viewpoint, right? He wanted the viewpoint to be from the kids.
Okay.
So to have shown their faces would have taken the focus off of the kids and put it on the adults.
Okay.
And it was kind of the same thing with the voices. Like, if the parents can start telling them what to do, right, the focus changes. And so he just never wanted that to be what he did. Now, oddly enough, in She's a Good Skate, Charlie Brown, which was one of the shows that I did, she actually spoke for the first time.
Oh, I haven't seen that. I didn't know that. Okay.
And Peppermint Patty keeps falling asleep. And she finally says, Patricia, wake up.
Okay.
And then I also noticed in Bon Voyage, Charlie Brown, there are some shots that are further back. I think it's the bakery owner.
But it's when they're in France, so Bon Voyage, they're going over to Europe, and they're kind of retracing steps of, you know, Sparky's, when he was in the war in France. And so because the perspective, I think, gets so blown up because, and it's meant to be big, because we're really getting kind of the gravity of what happened during the war and everything. I think that that's what, because you see a lot of adults in that, and you hear them talking French, I think if I remember
Yeah.
correctly.
Yeah.
And it is kind of weird when you watch that special because you're like, wait. It does something. It feels bigger than the other specials are, perspectively.
Okay.
And but it is weird. It almost felt like this is. But I think he almost had to do that because they were traveling to Europe, and I don't know. But it feels weird.
Yeah, I mean, it was the same with the Mayflower special as well, where they were back in time with the Pilgrims, and the kids were represented there with the adults and the Indians and everything too. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Most of what was done was very intentional on his part, and on the part of Lee Mendelsohn, who was the producer, and Bill Melendez, who was the director. Like, they were very clear on what their focus was and how they wanted these kids to be represented. Because in a lot of ways, a lot of the situations that they were in were adult type situations. And so if you put that adult in, it was just gonna throw off the balance of things.
And it almost like, especially the wisdom that comes out of, say, Linus or whatever. If you have an adult, like, it kind of waters down the wisdom of the children,
Yeah,
kind of.
Yeah.
that's fair.
That's the way I feel
Yeah.
about it anyway. But,
Yeah.
I think that's fair.
yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's fair.
Yeah.
How much do you know as to how much of a conscious choice was Vince Gerard?
That's exactly what I was gonna ask.
Gerard.
That's exactly what I was gonna ask.
Wait, how much of it?
Vince Guaraldi.
Like,
Vince Guaraldi.
The music.
Did Schultz say, I want this guy,
That's
this
exactly what I was gonna
composer, and his trio, or?
So the story that I heard was that it was actually Lee Mendelsohn who had been introduced to him, and sort of pulled him into the special, the very first special. And Vince absolutely loved the work that he did on that show, and said throughout his life that, like, that was his iconic time. That was his most prolific writing. And he had a career before that. He had a career after that. But there's still something so special about
That music.
that music that
You never get tired of listening to
Oh,
it.
yeah.
never,
It's amazing.
Yeah.
It is. You
Right?
never- It could be on endless loop, and you never get tired of listening to it.
exactly, exactly.
I mean, it's not Christmas
Mhm.
until Vince Guaraldi's album is on.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
It sets a tone. You instantly are in Peanuts tone and cozy and like safe and nostalgic and memories. It does all of it. It's such good music.
yeah. And you can't play it without people wanting to do the dance, right? We all know what the dance is, right? And you don't have to be a good dancer to do it.
Right.
But it's fun and it's joyful, and I think for me that's what really sparks in that music, is that there's just such a joyful, playful sense to the music, you know.
I don't know
Da-da-da-da-da-da.
if the jazz part of it was, you mentioned each of these characters representing different psychological instruments, if you will.
Yeah,
And there's a lot of improvisation going on, and, you know, we're all this sort of composition of all of those elements. And so
yeah,
I thought there was maybe
That's
more of
beautiful.
a conscious.
Right?
I want this to be jazz because this is how we.
I
do
can't
it.
speak to that, but you know,
yeah,
I wouldn't be surprised. I wouldn't be surprised. Well, we know that different characters have different themes. So there's
Yes.
and I think that the theme song is called Linus and
It
Lucy.
is.
the main one that most people know is Linus and Lucy, but they did each have their their own song. Peppermint Patty has her own theme song. And when you start to like recognize each one, because I've listened to it enough at this point that I know which one is for which. And so they'll walk onto the screen and they'll play a little snippet. And you may not know that you know Peppermint Patty's theme music, and yet, once you hear it and you know what it is, you go, oh yeah, that totally makes sense. Like he really understood the characters from a musical standpoint. And I think that's another part of what made this thing so beautiful, was that they all, there's been a thing about, I understand the assignment.
Yeah.
They all understood the assignment, and they all worked together to make this amazing show. And the other really interesting thing that a lot of people don't know is that Lee Mendelson and Sparky didn't like each other. They worked together for some 30, 40 years, and they really didn't like each other. But this project was so important to them both that they worked through their differences to make this. And I don't think any other group of people could have done what they did so magically.
Yeah.
Yeah. Any other questions? Well, I think this has been great. Thank you so much. Thank you for your questions. I mean, you made me think of things I hadn't even thought of yet. So
Yeah.
now I have to go. No, it's great. I have to go do a deep dive now on Marcy.
I wish I knew, you probably remember the website, but there's a website out there that is the archive for every single,
Peanuts-search.com.
and literally you can, it's got a search function, so you can put in the date and it'll pull up what comic strip came out on that date. You can put in themes, you can put in characters. It is so cool. So,
Yeah.
I mean, especially when we're researching certain, like depression or anxiety or whatever, you put those terms in, and the comic strips pop up. It's very cool. So if any of y'all are like, oh, I would love to read these in order, or by theme, or by character, or whatever, that's a great website to be able to do it.
Yeah. Of course, the books are great too.
Yeah.
I don't have them all yet, but I would.
There's like so many.
Well, there's 26 that are the complete collection from the 50s to the very last one.
And they get expensive too. I mean,
Yes, they do.
Yes, they do.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I think you can get a complete set online for like $1,700.
Mhm.
I don't have that kind of money to drop on a series of books right at the moment, but I have been collecting them as I've gone along.
Yeah.
And sometimes I just sit and read them.
Yeah.
Like, they're so much fun.
We would love for y'all, feel free to listen to the podcast if you would like to. We always appreciate 5-star ratings on Apple Podcasts, of course. And yeah, just so thankful that y'all came out to,
Subscribe and like
Yes.
and follow and
Yeah.
do all that kind of stuff.
and feel free to reach out to us on, our
Yeah.
our website, contact, whatever. If y'all have questions,
Yeah.
we'd love to chat with you and
Yeah.
connect.
Yeah.
What's the name of the podcast?
It's called the Peanuts Gallery.
Okay.
Yeah. Just seemed fitting.
Yeah.
That's a good name.
It's funny because I had somebody reach out to me recently and go, hey, do you know about the history of the Peanuts Gallery?
Like the saying.
The saying. So it was originally started in vaudeville days, and the Peanuts Gallery were the people that were up in the balcony area, because those were the cheap seats, and they would sell peanuts, and if they didn't like the act, they would throw the peanuts down.
Ah,
And so this person reached out to me to say that it's a racist term. And I was like, yeah, no, it's not really. It's the poor people were up there. Now at one point, as vaudeville was sort of dying out and they just wanted people to fill the seats, that's when the African Americans were allowed up in those seats. So that's why people think that it's strictly a racist theme. It's not at all. Originally, the Peanuts Gallery, those people that would throw, were far more likely to be Irish and Polish. Because of the time frame, that's when all of those groups of people had come to America, and they were the, people that you hate on for the moment.
But I like to point out that all those people, the people that couldn't afford the seats,
Yeah.
and so they had to get the cheap seats, and the Irish people and the Polish people, also the people on the margins,
Yeah,
being centered in this term of Peanuts Gallery,
yeah.
which is exactly what Sparky was doing in his. Totally planned. We totally planned this out in the podcast.
Actually, I did plan that part of it.
Yes, like I said, we totally planned it.
But we would love for you to follow us and reach out to us.
Yeah.
And, yeah. And if there's somebody in particular maybe that you would like to see on the show, let us know.
Yeah.
'Cause there are some people sort of lined up. My ADHD, sometimes me getting back to people. But I have another 10 people that are supposed to be on the show, and I just haven't set it up yet. So, I need somebody to be my voice of reason.
You need a Marcy.
I need
You
a
know,
Marcy.
sir, if you only call those people back.
Right? Yeah, but you're Sally.
Oh yeah, that's true.
We didn't talk about Sally.
That's,
That's all right. Maybe next time.
I am voting for president.
Yes,
So
yes.
that's my.
Thank you again so
Yes.
much, you guys. We
Thank
really
you.
appreciate it.